Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
Every evening, my husband went to the garage and locked himself in. "I need some peace," he said. For 10 years, I never went in there. But one day, I accidentally pushed the door open and saw what he had been hiding from me all these years. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say you don't notice the moment a marriage starts dying. I used to disagree with that. I used to think I was the kind of woman who would notice. I was wrong. Derek and I had been married for 14 years when I finally pushed open that garage door. 14 years of shared grocery lists, of arguments about whose turn it was to call the plumber, of vacations to the Oregon coast where we'd eat clam chowder out of bread bowls and pretend we were still the people we'd been at 28. We lived in a beige colonial in Beaverton, Oregon. 3 bedrooms, a yard that Derek mowed every other Saturday, a neighborhood where people waved from driveways. From the outside, we looked exactly like what we were supposed to be. I worked part-time as a medical billing specialist, mostly from home. Derek was a financial consultant at a mid-size firm downtown. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, or so I believed. We had a joint account, a mortgage, 2 car payments, and a retirement fund that Derek managed because, as he always said, "Numbers are my thing, Sarah." I let him. That was my first mistake, though I didn't know it yet. The garage had always been Derek's space. He'd claimed it early in our marriage. Set up a workbench, hung tools on pegboard, bought a mini fridge for his beer. I had the kitchen, the reading nook off the hallway, the garden. He had the garage. That felt fair. That felt like the ordinary architecture of a long marriage. 2 people carving out their separate corners of a shared life. He started spending more time out there about 10 years ago. I remember because it was the autumn our daughter, Lily, started middle school, and I'd wanted Derek home more in the evenings for that reason. Kids that age need both parents visible, I felt. But Derek had started disappearing after dinner, not dramatically. Just quietly. He'd clear his plate, pour the last of whatever wine was open, and say, "I just need an hour to decompress." An hour became 2. 2 became the whole evening. "It's the stress at work," he told me. "I just need somewhere quiet." I understood stress. I didn't push. The garage door would close, and I would watch television alone, or read, or help Lily with homework. And I told myself this was just a phase. Men needed caves. I'd read somewhere. I gave him his cave. But did I ever actually believe that, even then? The first real signal, not a suspicion, just a small, cold feeling I couldn't name, came about 8 years ago. I'd been looking for our home insurance documents, which we kept in a file box on the kitchen shelf. I couldn't find the folder labeled Accounts. I asked Derek about it that weekend. "I moved things around," he said, not looking up from his phone. "I'm reorganizing. I'll handle it." He handled it. The folder reappeared 2 days later. I didn't look inside closely enough. Why didn't I? Then, about 4 years ago, our refrigerator broke. A repair that should have cost us nothing. We had savings, I'd seen the statements, $12,000 sitting in our emergency account. But Derek came home that evening looking tight around the eyes and said we'd need to put it on the credit card. "What about the savings?" I asked. "I moved it into a CD," he said. "Better return. We can't touch it for 6 months." That made sense. Derek was the numbers person. I nodded and signed the credit card slip and forgot about it. But the cold feeling came back. The second television we couldn't afford to replace outright. The roof repair. "We'll refinance a little. It's smarter that way." Lily's college fund that seemed, when I glimpsed a statement once, smaller than I'd expected. Each time Derek had an explanation. Each time the explanation was just fluent enough that I almost believed it. Almost. I started noticing other things. He kept his phone face down now, always. He'd become vague about work, where before he'd mentioned colleagues by name, complained about specific clients. Now he spoke in generalities. He'd begun driving a slightly different route home, which I only noticed because I happened to look out the window twice in 1 week. When I mentioned it, he shrugged. Construction on Morrison. There was no construction on Morrison. I drove it the next morning. But it was a Tuesday night in March. Lily was away at college by then, the house empty and too quiet, when I finally felt the first sharp, undeniable stab of it. Not suspicion. Certainty's ugly little cousin. I dropped a casserole dish. It shattered on the kitchen floor, and I went to the garage to get the dustpan, and I turned the handle, and the door didn't open. Derek had put a lock on the garage door. Not the big rolling door facing the street, the interior door, the one that connected the garage to the house. The door I had walked through 1,000 times without thinking. The door that led to my husband's private space inside our shared home. He'd installed a deadbolt. Sometime in the last few weeks, without mentioning it, without explaining it, Derek had locked me out. I stood there in my socks, a broken casserole dish on the floor behind me, and I stared at that lock. And I thought, 10 years of closed doors, and now an actual lock. I got the broom from the hallway closet. I swept up the ceramic pieces. I didn't say anything to Derek that night, but something in me had made a decision, even before my mind caught up to it. I didn't sleep that night. Derek came in from the garage around 10:30, smelling faintly of beer, and brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed beside me with the ease of a man who had nothing to hide. I lay on my side of the mattress and listened to his breathing slow into sleep and thought, how long have you been doing this? Not the lock specifically. The lock was new, but the hiding, how long had that been going on? I got up at 2 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, the way my mother used to do when she needed to think through a problem. I wrote at the top of the page, what do I actually know? Not what I feared, not what I imagined, what I knew. I knew our savings account had less than I'd expected when I'd glimpsed a statement 18 months ago. I knew Derek had become evasive about finances in ways that had, over the years, accumulated into a pattern I'd been actively choosing not to see. I knew he had locked the interior garage door. I knew that for 10 years, that garage had been a space I was tacitly discouraged from entering. I sat with that list for a long time. Then I wrote a second column. What could explain this innocently? A hobby he was embarrassed about, a surprise he was planning, some private struggle, gambling maybe, or debt he was ashamed to admit. I tried to be fair. I tried to be the kind of wife who assumed the best. But by 3 in the morning, I had stopped being that wife. That wife had been too expensive. What I needed to understand first was the money. If Derek had been concealing finances, there would be evidence somewhere. Not in the garage necessarily, but in documents and accounts, in the digital trail that modern financial life leaves, whether you want it to or not. The problem was that for 14 years, I had willingly kept myself ignorant of our financial details. I had trusted Derek because he was competent and because trust felt like love, and because looking too closely had always seemed like an accusation. Now I was going to look closely. The next morning, I waited until Derek left for work. Then I went to the kitchen shelf where we kept files, and I went through every folder carefully, which took about an hour. What I found was not reassuring. There were statements for our joint checking account and one credit card. But the investment accounts, the retirement fund, the brokerage account Derek had opened 6 years ago, the college savings plan we'd set up for Lily, none of those statements were here. Derek had either moved them or, more likely, stopped having them mailed to the house. Everything would be online, and I didn't have the passwords. I sat down at my laptop and went to our bank's website. I had access to the joint checking. I knew that login. I pulled up 12 months of statements and started going through transactions line by line. It took me most of the morning. What I found made my stomach drop in the slow, terrible way of something you already knew before you knew it. Every month, without variation, a transfer of between $800 and $1,200 went to an account I didn't recognize. The transfers were labeled in Derek's meticulous way as PM, household. Patricia Marie, his mother's initials. Patricia Calloway, my mother-in-law. She lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. A woman I had never particularly liked and who had never particularly hidden her low opinion of me. She was 71, sharp as a tack, and had always treated Derek's marriage to me as a mild inconvenience to be endured. She called every Sunday. Derek took those calls in the garage. I wrote down the total of those transfers across 12 months, $11,400. Then I thought about how long this might have been going on. 5 years? 10? I felt something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was more like standing at the edge of a very large hole and only just now noticing the ground had been crumbling for years. That afternoon, I called my friend Donna Reyes, who worked as an office manager for a law firm in Portland. I didn't tell her everything. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but I asked her a careful question. If someone thought their spouse might be hiding financial assets, what would be the first smart step? Donna didn't ask too many questions. She was that kind of friend. She said, "Document everything you can access right now before he knows you're looking, and find a divorce attorney who specializes in financial concealment, not just a general family law person. And Sarah?" She paused. "Don't tell him you're looking." I thanked her and hung up and sat very still. Then I got up, went to the home office, and photographed every bank statement in that filing cabinet with my phone. All of them. I uploaded the photos to a Google Drive account I created that afternoon using an email address Derek didn't know about. A bland, forgettable address with no version of my name in it. I was not a dramatic person. I was not a confrontational person. I had spent 14 years being accommodating and reasonable and trusting, and it had cost me in ways I was only beginning to calculate. But I was methodical, and I was done being kept in the dark. My first plan was simple: find out the full scope of what was hidden before Derek knew I was looking, get an attorney, get an accountant, and do it quietly. The garage door still had its lock, but I had started to find other keys. I found my attorney through Donna's firm. Not one of their attorneys, but a referral to a woman named Claire Hutchins, who practiced family law with a specific focus on marital asset disputes. Her office was in a converted Victorian on the west side of Portland, and when I walked in for my first consultation on a Thursday morning, I felt the particular shame of a woman who has finally admitted to herself that her life is not what she thought it was. Claire was in her 50s, direct in the way that competent women often are when they have run out of patience for softness. She listened to everything I said without writing much down, which I later understood meant she was the kind of lawyer who processed things internally and quickly. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "The transfers to Patricia Calloway alone may not prove intent, but if there are investment accounts that have been restructured without your knowledge or consent, that's a different matter. You're a joint account holder on those." "I believe so," I said. "Derek always handled the paperwork." Claire nodded slowly. "We're going to need a forensic accountant." She recommended a woman named Ruth Adler, who worked independently and specialized in exactly this kind of case. I called Ruth that same afternoon. She had a flat, businesslike manner on the phone and quoted me a retainer that made me wince. But I paid it using money from my personal savings account, the small one I'd maintained quietly since early in our marriage, almost out of instinct, the one Derek didn't know about. Funny how the instincts we dismiss in ourselves turn out to be the wisest parts of us. Ruth asked me to gather everything I could access: statements, tax returns, any financial correspondence I could find. I sent her everything I'd already photographed. She told me she'd have preliminary findings within 10 days. I drove home and made dinner and sat across from Derek at the kitchen table and talked about the neighbor's new fence and whether we should repaint the front door this summer. He poured wine and laughed at something on television, and that night reached for me in the way he occasionally still did, and I moved away and said I was tired, and he turned over without protest. Was he already suspicious of me, or was he simply that confident? 6 days later, Ruth Adler called. She'd found the investment accounts, 2 brokerage accounts, and a Roth IRA, all technically joint, all administered exclusively by Derek. And what she'd found in those accounts was systematic. Over the course of approximately 7 years, Derek had been making transfers from our joint investment portfolio into a separate account. One opened in his name only, structured as a sole proprietorship business account under a consulting LLC he had registered in Delaware. The LLC had a name I didn't recognize: Callaway Strategic Advisors, LLC. Its registered agent was listed as Patricia Calloway. Patricia, always Patricia. The total amount transferred over 7 years, Ruth estimated, was somewhere between $180,000 and $220,000. She was still tracing the full picture. I sat in my car in a parking garage downtown when Ruth told me this, because I'd been running an errand when she called, and I remember the concrete pillars around me and the way the fluorescent light buzzed and the sound of my own breathing going very careful and controlled. "Is this legal?" I asked. "Without your documented consent as joint account holder, no," Ruth said. "This looks like intentional dissipation of marital assets, and the LLC structure, with his mother as registered agent, suggests premeditation. This isn't impulsive. This has been planned." Planned. That word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Derek hadn't fallen into hiding money the way someone might fall into a bad habit. He had built something. He had built a structure over years to move our shared life out from under me, and his mother had helped him. I managed to thank Ruth and tell her to keep going, and then I sat in that parking garage for 15 minutes and did not cry, which surprised me. What I felt was not grief yet. It was something harder and colder. The complete, irrevocable end of uncertainty. I had been afraid, until this moment, that I was wrong, that I was the suspicious, paranoid wife who had nearly dismantled a decent marriage over locked doors and vague feelings. I had dreaded being that woman, I was not that woman. That evening, something shifted in Derek. I don't know what had changed on his end, whether someone at his firm had mentioned something, whether Patricia had sensed something in our last clipped Sunday dinner phone call, whether Derek had simply noticed the slight change in my posture that Donna later told me she could see in a photograph of me from that period. But he came home and looked at me in a new way, a measuring way. "You seem far away lately," he said. "Just tired," I said, and smiled and handed him his plate. He watched me for a moment longer than necessary. The lock on the garage door was still there, but the secret it was guarding had already escaped it. I had my proof. I had my attorney. I had my accountant. Now I needed to decide what to do with them. Claire moved quickly once I gave her the go-ahead. The legal strategy was straightforward in principle, complex in execution. File for divorce citing economic misconduct, simultaneously freeze the joint accounts and request court-ordered disclosure of all financial records, and petition for a forensic audit of Callaway Strategic Advisors, LLC. Ruth Adler would serve as our expert witness on the financial side. Claire had done this kind of case before. She was calm in a way I was trying to learn from. I signed the paperwork on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, Derek had been served at his office. I was not there when it happened. I was sitting in Donna's kitchen drinking coffee because I'd known I didn't want to be in the house. Donna didn't say much. She refilled my mug and put a plate of toast in front of me, and we talked about her daughter's soccer league for 20 minutes, and I was grateful to her in a way that had no adequate words. Derek called me 4 times between noon and 2 o'clock. I let all 4 calls go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to speak to him. I didn't yet know which version of Derek would be on the other end, the wounded one, the angry one, or the one who would try to explain it all away in that fluent, plausible voice he had. The 5th call came from a number I recognized with a lurch of cold dread. Patricia. I didn't answer that one either. Derek was home when I got back that evening. He was sitting in the living room, not the garage, with the lights off, which should have told me something. Derek in the dark. Derek waiting for me in the main part of the house instead of retreating to his locked room. "You want to tell me what you think you're doing?" he said. The voice was controlled. That was the Derek I'd gotten. Not the wounded one, not the angry one yet. The controlled one, which was always the most dangerous. "I think the filing speaks for itself," I said. He stood up. "Sarah, you have no idea what you've done. You need to stop this. Call Claire Hutchins and tell her to stand down, and we will sit down together and I will explain everything." "You had 7 years to explain everything," I said. That was when the control slipped. Just for a moment. Something moved across his face that I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Something more calculated than anger. "My mother is involved in this," he said. "If you push this, you push it on her too. She's 71 years old, Sarah. Do you understand what a legal proceeding could do to her?" There it was. "You should have thought about that," I said, "before you made her the registered agent of your shell company." The next morning, Patricia called again, and this time I answered because I had decided that avoiding her was a form of fear I no longer had room for. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Patricia Callaway had never been a pleasantries woman. She told me in the crisp, even tone she used to discuss everything from the weather to moral failures that I was making a very serious mistake, that whatever I thought I had found, I didn't understand the full picture, that Derek had been protecting our family's financial future in ways I was too short-sighted to appreciate, that if I continued down this road, I would regret it. She used that word twice, regret. Then she said, "I have resources you are not aware of, Sarah. I want you to think very carefully." I wrote down her exact words after I hung up. I emailed them to Claire. Claire's response arrived within the hour. "This is attempted intimidation. Document everything. Do not respond. Do not engage with her directly again." The week that followed was one of the hardest of my life. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because I had to continue living in a state of low-grade siege while looking normal. Derek moved to the guest room without being asked, or perhaps because he wanted to. And we passed each other in the hallway of our house like tenants who shared plumbing and nothing else. He went to the garage every night still. Old habits. By Friday, I was exhausted in my bones. I drove up to the coast that weekend, Cannon Beach, alone. I rented a small room at a place I'd stayed once before, and I walked on the sand in the early morning when no one else was out, and I let myself feel all of it. The grief for the marriage I thought I'd had, the fear of what came next, the strange and quiet fury that had been keeping me upright. I ate clam chowder from a bread bowl by myself and cried a little and then stopped. When I drove back Sunday evening, I felt steadier, not happy, not safe, but clear. The call came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after Derek had been served. It was Derek's voice, but a different register than I'd heard before. Softer, carefully calibrated. He asked if he could take me to dinner. Just dinner, he said. Not to argue, not to negotiate, just to talk. The way two people who had built a life together deserved to talk before lawyers consumed everything. I said I would think about it. I called Claire first. She told me I was legally permitted to have a conversation with my husband, but that I should not discuss the case, should not make any agreements, and should document the encounter afterward. "If he's asking you to dinner, he wants something," she said. "Go in knowing that." I agreed to meet him at a restaurant on Northwest 23rd. Neutral ground, public, a place we'd been to on early dates, which I suspected was a deliberate choice. Derek was not an unsophisticated man. He looked tired. He'd lost weight since I'd last really looked at him. He ordered wine and waited until the server had gone before he spoke, and what he said surprised me in its directness. "I know how this looks," he said, "and I know I should have talked to you. But Sarah, the LLC, the account, it was supposed to be for us, for our retirement. I did it the way I did it because of taxes, because of how the firm structures things, and yes, because I didn't think you'd understand the mechanics of it. That was wrong. I should have explained. But this isn't theft. This is our money." It was a good speech, measured, reasonable. He even had the grace to include an admission of wrongdoing, the "I should have explained," which gave it the texture of humility without conceding anything material. I watched him deliver it and felt nothing shift in me. That was new. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Derek speaking in that calm, reasonable voice would have been enough to make me doubt my own perception. I had a long history of doubting my own perception around this man. But I had Ruth Adler's numbers in front of me. I had bank records going back 7 years, and I had, sitting in my memory, Patricia's voice on the phone. "I have resources you are not aware of." "Derek," I said, "if this was always our money, handled correctly for tax purposes, then a forensic accountant would be able to confirm that, and you'd welcome the audit." He looked at me for a moment. Something moved in his eyes, not the calculated thing I'd seen before, but something closer to the real man whoever that was, anymore. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I said. I paid for my own meal and drove home. What I needed now, and what I had been quietly building, was something that no lawyer could provide. Witnesses to the person I was, the marriage I'd lived in, the reality that Derek and Patricia would likely try to paint in unflattering colors if this went to litigation. Character, in a divorce proceeding, wasn't irrelevant. Donna had already offered to provide a statement about the conversation in which I'd confided my suspicions. The timeline of when I'd first reached out to her mattered, but I needed more. The woman who became my most important ally arrived unexpectedly. Her name was Janet Farrow, and I'd known her loosely through a neighborhood association. She was a CPA who'd recently retired from a firm where she'd done forensic auditing work for the IRS for 20 years. We'd had coffee twice. She was 70, a widow, with the demeanor of someone who had spent decades looking at fraud and found most of it surprisingly banal. I called her on a whim, or what felt like a whim. She picked up on the second ring. I told her everything. It took an hour. She listened the way Ruth Adler listened, without audible reaction, just occasional short questions. When I finished, Janet said, "I've seen this structure before. Delaware LLC, family member as registered agent, transfers dressed as business expenses. It's a pattern. Sloppy, actually, by sophisticated standards, which means your husband isn't a financial criminal. He's a financially literate man who believed his wife wouldn't look." That sentence rearranged something in my chest. "Would you be willing to speak with my attorney?" I asked. "Yes," Janet said. "And I'll tell you something else for free. Patricia Calloway, if she knew about this and participated, may have personal liability, depending on what your accountant finds." Patricia, personal liability. For the first time since I'd pushed open the garage door in my mind, since the lock, since the parking garage phone call, since the dinner, I felt something that was adjacent to calm, not triumph. I wasn't there yet, but the cold, steady sensation of a foundation settling under my feet. I thanked Janet and hung up and sat in my garden for a while, in the last of the October sun, listening to my neighbor's wind chimes. Derek was in the garage. I could hear the light click on through the side wall. Let him have his cave. I was building something else. Patricia arrived on a Thursday afternoon without calling first. That was a choice, not an oversight. Patricia had never done anything unintentionally in her life. I was in the kitchen when I heard the car in the driveway. An Uber, which meant she'd flown up from Scottsdale and come directly here, which meant this visit had been planned with some deliberateness. I watched from the window as she climbed out, impeccably dressed in pale gray, a woman who, at 71, still moved with the kind of precision that announces I have always been correct about everything. I did not open the door until she knocked. Let her knock. "Sarah," she said when I opened it. Her voice was warm. Her eyes were measuring the distance between us with the efficiency of a surveyor. "Patricia," I said, "I didn't know you were coming." "I wanted to see you in person," she said. "This is too important for phone calls." I let her in because turning her away would have looked like fear, and I was no longer willing to look afraid. I offered her coffee because I was raised to be courteous, even to people who had helped redirect $200,000 of my money into their own orbit. She accepted and sat at my kitchen table, and for a moment we were just two women in a kitchen in October, and the fiction of normalcy was almost convincing. Almost. "I know you're angry," Patricia began. "I would be angry too in your position. Derek handled this badly. I've told him that. She paused with the precise timing of a woman who had rehearsed this. But Sarah, you have to understand that what he did out of love. For both of you. He was trying to protect your future in a way that, yes, he should have told you. But the intent was never to hurt you. This was good. This was very good. The acknowledgement of Derek's wrongdoing delivered in a tone that made it sound like a minor administrative error. The invocation of love. The reframe of concealment as protection. The intent, I said, is something a forensic accountant is currently evaluating. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Sarah, a legal proceeding will destroy this family. It will cost both of you enormously, financially, emotionally. Lily will be affected. You know that. Lily, she brought Lily into it. Lily is 21 years old, I said. She's an adult, and I haven't spoken to her about the specifics of this. She'll find out, Patricia said. These things become public, court records. These things follow people. I looked at her across my kitchen table and thought about the registered agent form Ruth had found. Patricia Marie Calloway, listed by choice, with full knowledge of what that LLC was built to do. Patricia, I said, I want to be clear about something. My attorney has advised me not to discuss the case with you. That advice stands. I've let you in out of courtesy, but this conversation is over. The warmth left her face entirely. What was underneath it was not angry exactly. It was something more controlled than anger. A kind of compressed, functional fury that had probably been there all along, underneath 14 years of mild disdain. You are making a mistake, she said, that you will not be able to undo. You said that on the phone, I replied. You mentioned resources. I've documented that conversation and provided it to my attorney. I want you to know that. She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at me for a long moment in a way that I will not fully forget, not because it frightened me, but because in it I saw something clearly for the first time. She had never respected me, not in 14 years. To Patricia, I had always been an obstacle. Something Derek had unfortunately acquired that she'd been managing around ever since. Knowing that made everything simpler. She left without finishing her coffee. I heard the Uber pull up 3 minutes later. I watched from the window until the car turned the corner. Then I sat down. My hands were trembling very slightly. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from adrenaline, from the strange physical cost of sitting very still while someone threatens you, from the effort of keeping my voice level. The trembling passed in a few minutes. What didn't pass was the clarity that came after it. Patricia's visit had been a last effort to make me doubt myself, to wrap intimidation in the language of family, of love, of Lily, of consequences. All the soft weapons that had probably worked on me before, in smaller ways, over many years. This time, you've gone too far. This time, consider what you're risking. The language of women who've been talked out of things by people who loved them. I wasn't talked out of it. I called Claire that evening and told her about the visit. She was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. That she came in person, that's actually helpful. It speaks to her level of concern about the outcome. You documented the conversation? I wrote it down immediately after, I said. Perfect, send it to me tonight. I sent it. Then I called Janet Farrow and told her about the registered agent and Patricia's visit, and Janet listened and then said very quietly, She came all the way from Scottsdale. She's scared. Scared. I sat with that word for a long time. The deposition was held on a November morning in Claire's office on the west side of Portland. A deposition is not a courtroom. There's no judge, no gallery, no formal theater. It's a conference room with bad coffee and a court reporter, and it has a quality of intimacy that makes it, in some ways, more exposing than testimony in open court. You cannot project. You cannot play to an audience. You simply have to answer the question in front of you while a skilled attorney dismantles the story you have been telling for years. Derek had retained an attorney named Franklin Marsh, who I learned later had been recommended by Patricia. She had apparently used him in some capacity years earlier. Claire had mentioned his name without particular alarm, which I took as reassurance that she was not intimidated by him. Derek arrived in a gray suit. He looked better than he had at dinner, more composed, more like the version of himself he'd decided to present. He sat across the conference table and nodded at me with the expression of a man being patient with an unfortunate situation. Ruth Adler was there. Janet Farrow was there as a consulting expert. Claire sat beside me with a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting, so small I couldn't read it from my angle. Franklin Marsh opened with predictable framing. The LLC had been established for legitimate tax purposes. The transfers were documented business expenses. Patricia's role as registered agent was administrative only and had involved no financial participation. Then Claire began. She asked Derek calmly and methodically about every transfer Ruth had traced. She asked about the dates. She asked about the corresponding documentation. She asked whether I had been informed of each transfer, whether I had provided consent, whether my signature appeared on any of the LLC's formation documents. It did not. She asked Derek to explain in specific terms what services Callaway Strategic Advisors, LLC, had provided to justify the fees it had received from our marital investment accounts. Derek answered the first few questions with the fluent competence of a man who had prepared, but Ruth had traced 7 years of transfers, and Claire had 7 years of questions. By the 20th question, Derek's answers had begun to recycle. By the 30th, Franklin Marsh had interjected 6 times with objections that Claire walked through with unvarying courtesy. Then Claire asked about a specific transfer, $47,000 in March of 2021, the largest single transfer Ruth had found, moved from our joint brokerage account to the LLC, and within 11 days, from the LLC into a personal savings account in Patricia Callaway's name. Derek stopped. The pause was not long, perhaps 4 seconds. But in a deposition, 4 seconds is a geological age. I'd need to review the documentation on that specific transfer, he said. We have the documentation, Claire said. Ruth Adler will walk us through it. But I'd like to ask you first, in your own words, what was the purpose of that transfer? Franklin Marsh objected. Claire waited. Derek looked at his attorney, and in that look I saw it. The first crack in the edifice. Not guilt exactly. The specific expression of a man who has just understood that the structure he built was not as solid as he believed. That related to a loan, Derek said. To my mother, a personal loan. A loan, Claire repeated. Is there documentation of the loan terms? It was a family arrangement. Is there a promissory note? Silence. Is there any written record of the loan terms, the repayment schedule, or your wife's consent to make this loan from your joint marital assets? Derek looked at Franklin. Franklin's expression had acquired a quality of careful neutrality. I don't believe there's a formal document, Derek said. What happened in the next 2 hours was not dramatic by television standards. There was no confession, no raised voice, no revelation of a secret life. It was quieter than that, and more devastating. Claire moved through 7 years of transactions with the patience of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to document. Derek's explanations accumulated into contradictions. The LLC that had been a tax structure became, in the course of questioning, also a loan vehicle, also an investment fund, also a business incubator for a consulting practice that had, apparently, never consulted on anything for anyone outside the family. I sat very still through all of it. I had promised myself I would not perform. I did not look satisfied or vindicated or grieving. I looked at the table and the documents and occasionally at Claire, and I breathed. When the deposition recessed for lunch, Derek and Franklin Marsh went into the hallway, and I heard through the closed door the low, urgent sound of an argument. Patricia had not been present. She had not been invited. But Claire had told me that morning that a separate deposition for Patricia was scheduled for the following week. "How do you feel?" Claire asked me quietly during the break. I thought about it honestly. "Like it's almost over," I said. Patricia's deposition was worse for her than Derek's had been for him. I say worse because Derek, whatever else he was, had at least operated in a world where financial complexity could be invoked as partial camouflage. Patricia had no such cover. Her role was administrative, she'd claimed, signature only. She'd simply agreed to be listed as registered agent as a favor to her son. Claire's questions established, with the methodical patience I had come to recognize as her signature, that Patricia had received wire transfers totaling $94,000 over 6 years into her personal Scottsdale savings account, that she had, on 4 occasions, signed documents on behalf of Callaway Strategic Advisors, LLC, that authorized those transfers, that she had, in 2 emails recovered from Derek's phone during the discovery process, explicitly discussed the strategy of keeping the accounts out of Sarah's name for planning purposes. Those emails, Ruth had found them in the discovery material Derek's attorney had been legally compelled to produce. In one, Patricia had written to Derek, "If she ever looks, the LLC creates distance. That's the point." In another, sent 8 months before Derek had installed the lock on the garage door, "You need to move faster. If she gets a lawyer first, you lose the leverage." If she gets a lawyer first, you lose the leverage. When Claire read that email aloud during Patricia's deposition, I watched my mother-in-law's face with the attention I'd spent 14 years directing elsewhere. Patricia did not collapse. She was too controlled for collapse. But the architecture of her composure shifted in a way that was unmistakable. The careful woman behind the careful face recalculating in real time. "I would need to see the context of that email," Patricia said. Claire provided it. There was no exculpatory context. The case did not go to trial. It didn't need to. 2 weeks after Patricia's deposition, Franklin Marsh contacted Claire with a settlement offer. It was inadequate. Derek had clearly advised him to open low, and Claire declined it in a single paragraph. 10 days later, a second offer arrived. Closer. Still not enough. What changed the trajectory was Janet Farrow. Janet had, in the weeks since our kitchen conversation, done something I hadn't asked her to do. She had, using her contacts from 20 years of forensic auditing, quietly verified that Callaway Strategic Advisors, LLC, had filed federal business tax returns, claiming expenses that did not correspond to any documented business activity. She brought this to Claire, who brought it to Ruth, and Ruth prepared a supplemental report that raised, for the first time in explicit terms, the possibility of referral to the IRS. When Franklin Marsh received that supplemental report, the third settlement offer arrived within 48 hours. It was everything Claire had said I was entitled to. I received 60% of all marital assets, including the investment accounts, the home equity, and a cash settlement that represented Derek's acknowledgement of the unauthorized transfers. Derek was required to dissolve Callaway Strategic Advisors, LLC. Patricia, through a separate agreement negotiated quietly between attorneys, agreed to repay $94,000 in funds received, structured as a return of personal loans in the legal language. But we all knew what it was. The IRS referral was held in abeyance contingent on full compliance with the settlement terms. I signed the final documents on a Tuesday morning in December. It was raining in Portland, which is not unusual, and the light was the low gray that the city wears most of winter. I drove to Claire's office alone and signed 11 pages and accepted a copy in a manila folder and shook Claire's hand and thanked her. "You did the hard part," Claire said. "So did you," I said. I sat in my car afterward for a few minutes in the parking garage. A different one from where Ruth had called me with her first findings. But parking garages have a way of looking the same, and I thought about that other morning. That fluorescent buzz, the cold drop in my stomach when Ruth first said $180,000. What I felt now was not the euphoria I had perhaps expected. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of having carried something very heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. The house had been listed in October. It sold in 3 weeks. Derek moved into an apartment in Northeast Portland. I didn't know what Patricia was doing. She had apparently returned to Scottsdale, and I found that I didn't need to know. I took Lily to dinner the week after the signing. She knew most of the outlines. I'd been honest with her, carefully, without weaponizing details. She'd been quiet and sad and loyal in the way that good kids are when their parents' marriage ends. She'd ordered the pasta and we'd split a bottle of wine and she'd said, "Mom, I'm proud of you." That made me cry more than any of the rest of it. I bought a house in the spring. Not the Colonial in Beaverton. That life was sold and signed away, and I felt no grief about the house itself, only occasionally about the version of myself who had lived in it. The new house was smaller, older, with a porch that faced west and got the evening light, and a garden that had been let go for a few years and was waiting to be reclaimed. It was in a neighborhood in Northeast Portland where I knew no one, which felt exactly right. Donna helped me move. Janet Farrow came with wine and took charge of the kitchen boxes. Lily drove up from Eugene, hung curtains in my bedroom, made pancakes in the morning, and left the kitchen clean. I stood in the living room that first Saturday evening after everyone had gone, with takeout containers on the floor and nothing on the walls, and the April light coming through the west-facing windows. And I felt something I can only describe honestly as peace. Not the absence of trouble, but the specific peace of a woman who has looked at the truth of her own life and decided not to flinch. I started working full-time again, picked up new clients, took on an office management role I hadn't expected to enjoy and did. I joined a hiking group. I started cooking properly again, for myself, a pleasure I'd forgotten about in the years of making dinners that had to be ready when someone else came home from the garage. In August, I took a week alone in Vermont and walked through small towns and read 3 novels and felt for the first time in a very long time like a person rather than a function. Were there hard nights? Yes. Sometimes I'd wake at 2 in the morning and feel the old fear, not of Derek, but of my own long accommodation. That was harder to make peace with than anything he had done. I had chosen not to see. I had reasons, but I had chosen it. I'm telling you that because I think it matters. As for Derek, he had left the firm or been asked to leave and was working at a smaller operation across the river. He'd started dating someone. I wished him nothing violent. I wished him a long and well-considered life. Patricia was navigating a federal inquiry into the LLC's historic filings and a $94,000 repayment agreement. I felt no satisfaction at that. Only a tired acknowledgement that accountability, even when it comes late, tends to arrive. The garage at my new house became mine. I set up a workbench, started refinishing old furniture from estate sales, kept the door open in good weather, and worked in the evenings in the slanted light. One afternoon in October, Lily came over and found me sanding the legs of a mid-century dresser, covered in dust, laughing at something on the radio. She stood in the doorway and looked at me. "You seem like yourself," she said. "I think I finally am," I said. 10 years. 10 years I didn't open that door. Not because I couldn't, but because I had decided that trust meant looking away. What I learned is this: trust that requires you to stay blind is not trust. It is management. When I finally pushed that door open, when I looked at the lock and decided I was done flinching, I didn't find a monster. I found a man who had counted on my silence, and a woman who had helped him count on it. The most important thing I reclaimed wasn't the money, it was the habit of looking. What would you have done? How long would you have waited? Leave a comment below. I'd love to know. And if this story stayed with you, please subscribe. Thank you so much for being here until the very last word.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.